April 8, 1940. 04:17 hours, the waters of the Oslofjord, Norway. The German heavy cruiser Blücher moves north at reduced speed through the dark, her bow cutting the flat black water of the narrowest stretch of the fjord, the channel barely a kilometer wide at this point, the rocky hillside of Oscarsborg Fortress rising on the western shore. She is carrying more than 1,000 men, Wehrmacht infantry, Gestapo officers, naval personnel, administrative staff, who are not sailors but passengers. They are the advance cadre of the German occupation government of Norway, and they are aboard the Blücher because the plan requires Oslo to be seized in the first hours of the operation, before the Norwegian government can evacuate, before the king can escape, before anyone with the authority to organize resistance can reach a telephone. The cruiser is not alone. Behind her come the heavy cruiser Lützow and the light cruiser Emden and a constellation of smaller vessels. It is before dawn, the water is cold, the plan is precise. At the fortress of Oscarsborg, the guns have been in place since 1892. They are operated by a garrison of retired officers and naval cadets who have been called back to service, men who know that these guns have not been fired in a genuine combat engagement in the living memory of anyone now standing behind them. The commander of Oscarsborg is Oberst Birger Eriksen, 65 years old, a man who has spent his career in Norwegian coastal artillery and who is now looking through the darkness at the silhouettes of German warships entering Norwegian territorial waters without invitation, without declaration of war, without any communication whatsoever. He gives an order. At 04:21, the fortress opens fire. The Blücher takes 2 shells from the main battery and then, as she passes the secondary guns, a torpedo from a 19th century torpedo battery that no one in Berlin believed was still operational. She burns, she lists. She carries to the bottom of the Oslofjord the men who were supposed to arrest the Norwegian government and end Norwegian resistance before it begins. 910 men are killed. Because of those 4 minutes, the 4 minutes between the first German ship entering the kill zone and the cruiser settling beneath the water, the Norwegian royal family escapes, the government escapes, the national gold reserves are loaded onto trucks and driven north through the darkness, and Norway becomes not a capitulation but a campaign. It is the first thing that goes wrong. It is not the last. This is the story of why Germany invaded Norway, what it cost them to do it, and why the decision that seemed, in April 1940, like one of the most brilliant strategic gambits of the war, spent the next 5 years draining the Wehrmacht of resources it could never replace. It is a story about iron ore and U-boats, and a man named Vidkun Quisling, and a British Prime Minister who is about to find himself elevated to power by the consequences of his own miscalculations. It is a story about how strategic logic, when it outpaces operational capacity, does not produce victory. It produces a trap from which there is no clean exit. And it begins not in Norway at all. It begins 6 months earlier in the cold waters off the Norwegian coast, with a British naval action and an act of piracy at sea that sets the entire mechanism in motion. The Royal Navy auxiliary vessel Altmark is a German supply ship. In February 1940, she is making her way south through Norwegian territorial waters with approximately 300 British prisoners of war in her hold, men taken from merchant ships sunk by the German pocket battleship Graf Spee in the South Atlantic. The British government knows the Altmark is in Norwegian waters. It knows about the prisoners. And on February 16th, HMS Cossack under Captain Philip Vian enters the Jøssingfjord on the Norwegian coast, comes alongside the Altmark and boards her. The boarding party finds the prisoners, breaks open the hatches and brings them up into the cold Norwegian air. The Norwegians, whose neutrality has just been violated in their own fjord, protest formally to London. They are, in effect, ignored. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, considers the Altmark incident a triumph. He writes that it demonstrates British resolve. What it demonstrates to the German High Command is something considerably more alarming. If Britain is willing to violate Norwegian neutrality to board a German ship in a Norwegian fjord, then Norwegian neutrality is not a protection against British action. It is only a protection if the British choose to respect it. And the British, it is now clear, will not always choose to respect it. This matters enormously because Norway's neutrality is the thing that makes Norway useful to Germany. Through the winter of 1939 and 1940, approximately 11 million tons of iron ore are moving south from the Swedish mining complex at Kiruna and Gällivare to the German steel industry every year. Roughly half of that ore moves by rail to the Norwegian ice-free port of Narvik, then south along the Norwegian coast through the sheltered channel between the mainland and the coastal islands known as the Leads, a passage that British surface warships cannot enter without violating international law. The ore reaches German ports. The German steel industry converts it into tank armor and artillery barrels and the hulls of U-boats and the railings of railway bridges. Remove the Narvik route by mining the Leads, by occupying Norway, by any other means, and Germany's steel production capacity drops by an estimated 30% by some calculations. The German war economy is not prepared for that. The Wehrmacht is not prepared for that. The war cannot be won without that iron ore. Admiral Erich Raeder, head of the Kriegsmarine, has been telling Hitler this since September 1939. He is not alone. The files of OKW, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, are full of memoranda about Norwegian iron ore, about Swedish railway lines, about the strategic geography of Scandinavia and what it means for the war at sea. The conclusion is consistent. Whoever controls Norway controls the steel pipeline that feeds the German war machine, and whoever controls the Norwegian coastline controls the approach routes for any naval power attempting to project force into the Baltic or the Arctic. And then the Altmark incident happens, and what has been a strategic calculation becomes something more urgent. If Britain is willing to breach Norwegian neutrality now, when the war is still quiet and no major land operations have begun, what will it do in the spring, when the weather improves and the ground dries and military operations in Scandinavia become possible? Raeder's answer is delivered to Hitler in a memorandum dated January 13, 1940. Germany must occupy Norway before Britain does. The decision to invade, Operation Weserübung, Exercise Weser, one of the most deceptive code names in the history of military operations, is made in principle that month. The planning begins immediately. The man chosen to command the operation is General-Leutnant Nikolaus von Falkenhorst, a German army officer selected not because of particular expertise in amphibious operations or any specialist knowledge of Scandinavia, but because he participated in a Baltic coastal operation in 1918 that bore some superficial resemblance to what is now being planned. Hitler summons Falkenhorst on February 21, 1940, gives him a few hours to study what materials are available. By some accounts, including a tourist guidebook to Norway found in a Berlin bookshop, and then asks for his operational concept. Falkenhorst produces one. It is, given the circumstances and the time constraints, remarkably coherent. Simultaneous landings at 6 Norwegian ports, Oslo, Kristiansand, Stavanger, Bergen, Trondheim and Narvik, coordinated with a ground invasion from the south through Denmark, executed at first light to minimize the window of naval exposure, with Luftwaffe air superiority as the essential enabling condition for everything that follows. Hitler approves it. He gives Falkenhorst 3 weeks to finalize the details. The operation is scheduled for April 9, 1940. Denmark will fall in a morning. Norway will fall in a week. That is the plan. What the plan does not account for is Birger Eriksen and the guns at Oscarsborg. What it does not account for is the fact that the Norwegian government, once it realizes what is happening, will not surrender. What it does not account for is the speed with which the British respond to the operation, or the difficulty of the terrain above Narvik once winter gives way to mud and snowmelt. or the fact that the German destroyers that deliver the mountain troops to Narvik are trapped there without fuel and will be systematically annihilated by the Royal Navy over the following days at a cost of 10 warships that Germany cannot replace. The plan is brilliant in conception. Its execution is something more complicated. The parallel story, the one running alongside the German operational planning through the winter of 1939 and 1940, is a British story, and it concerns the same iron ore and the same Norwegian territorial waters approached from the opposite direction. Churchill, sitting at the Admiralty, has been pressing for months for cabinet authorization to mine the leads. He is convinced that this single action, laying mines in Norwegian coastal waters to force German warships out into open sea, where the Royal Navy can intercept them, would deal a decisive blow to the German war economy without requiring a land operation. His arguments are strategically sound. His political masters keep refusing. The cabinet is worried about Norwegian diplomatic protests. The cabinet is worried about the neutrals. The cabinet is worried about international law. Churchill is not worried about any of these things. He is worried about German steel. He eventually wins the argument. On April 8, 1940, the day before Weserübung is scheduled to begin, the Royal Navy lays mines in Norwegian territorial waters. The British government simultaneously announces that it considers Norway's territorial waters no longer available as a German military corridor. The timing is, in retrospect, extraordinary. The British mine-laying operation and the German invasion force are moving through the same waters, in some cases within visual range of each other, on the same April night. British destroyers are laying mines in the leads while German troop ships are heading north for Norwegian ports. Neither force knows exactly where the other is or what it is about to encounter. The British operation is designed to provoke a German response by cutting off the ore route. The German operation is designed to preempt exactly that British action. They have each concluded that this moment is the decisive one, and they have each decided to act on the same night, and they reach their respective positions within hours of each other. The result is not a clean strategic exchange. The result is a campaign that neither side has fully planned for, fought in conditions that neither side has adequately assessed, over ground that will punish both of them in different ways and for different reasons. In the south, the German advance moves quickly. Danish resistance collapses on April 9th in a matter of hours. The Danish government, calculating that resistance against the Wehrmacht with no prospect of external relief would mean immediate and total destruction, surrenders before noon. The cost in Danish lives of that decision will be debated long after the war ends, but in the short run, Denmark is secured. Norway does not follow. Norwegian forces, small, only partially mobilized, armed with equipment that is in some cases 2 decades out of date, fight at Midskogen and Kvam and Vinjesvingen and a dozen places that will not appear in any general history of the Second World War. They delay. They conduct rearguard actions that buy hours and sometimes days. They destroy bridges. They block mountain roads. They are not enough to reverse the fundamental military equation. Germany has overwhelming Luftwaffe control of Norwegian skies, and the Luftwaffe proves decisive in ways that no one quite foresaw. But they are enough to ensure that Norway becomes a campaign rather than a sudden occupation, and that the campaign lasts long enough for the British and French to land forces of their own along the Norwegian coast. At Narvik, the situation becomes something stranger and more significant than either side intended. The German mountain troops under General Eduard Dietl, who have taken the port on April 9th with the destroyers that brought them from Germany, find themselves cut off within days. The destroyer force that delivered them is destroyed by the Royal Navy over 2 engagements, the first and second battles of Narvik, conducted on April 10th and April 13th respectively. 10 German destroyers, a third of the operational destroyer fleet of the Kriegsmarine, are sunk. The British land at several points along the Norwegian coast. French forces, including elements of the French Foreign Legion, fresh from operations elsewhere, deploy north to the Narvik area itself. For 6 weeks, the battle around Narvik is the most serious German military setback of the war to that point. Dietl's force, isolated, outnumbered, fighting in Arctic mountain terrain that offers no roads and minimal shelter, is pushed back step by step into the mountains above the port. By late May, he is on the verge of retreating into Sweden and accepting internment for the remainder of the war, which would have been, operationally, a German defeat at the one place in Norway where German forces held a port the Allies considered worth retaking. What saves Dietl is not a military reversal at Narvik. What saves him is France. On May 10, 1940, Germany launches its invasion of France and the Low Countries. The fall of France over the following 6 weeks, with a speed that stuns the world, including most of the German High Command, forces Britain to evacuate its forces from Norway. The campaign that is beginning to go wrong for Germany in the north is abandoned by the Allies because the south has become catastrophic. Dietl holds Narvik. Norway falls. The last Norwegian regular forces surrender on June 10, 1940, in the far north near the Swedish border. The campaign has cost Germany approximately 5,000 men killed and wounded, a significant quantity of aircraft and, critically, roughly a third of its operational surface fleet. 3 cruisers sunk, 10 destroyers sunk, numerous smaller vessels lost. The Kriegsmarine, which is never large enough to challenge the Royal Navy in open water, emerges from Norway significantly weaker than it entered it. It will not recover. Here is where the strategic calculation becomes complicated and where the argument that still divides historians begins. Germany now holds Norway. The iron ore route is secure. The Luftwaffe has bases along the Norwegian coast from which it can threaten British shipping across the North Sea and into the Atlantic. U-boats have access to Norwegian fjords and ports that extend operational range significantly into the North Atlantic, a concrete and measurable gain for the submarine campaign that is just beginning. Norwegian airfields allow German maritime patrol aircraft to reach far out into the Atlantic, closing the mid-ocean gap where Allied convoys are most vulnerable. These are real strategic gains. They are the gains that Raeder identified in his January memorandum, and they are real. The question is what they cost to maintain. Norway is a country of extraordinary geographical inconvenience for a military occupier. From its southernmost tip to the North Cape, which sits above the Arctic Circle in a landscape so extreme that in winter the sun does not rise at all for months, the country extends more than 1,700 kilometers. Its coastline, if straightened, would reach around the world. The interior is a wilderness of mountains and forests, and frozen lakes and narrow valleys that channel movement and prevent the kind of large-scale military maneuver that the Wehrmacht is trained and equipped to conduct. The population is barely 3 million people, and it is, from the first weeks of occupation, actively hostile. Resistance begins forming almost immediately after the June 1940 surrender, organized initially by officers who have escaped to Britain and returned by sea and by air, trained by British Special Operations executive agents who begin arriving in the winter of 1940 and 1941. The occupation that is supposed to be self-securing, maintained simply by the visible presence of German military power and ratified by the collaborationist government of Vidkun Quisling, turns out to require something considerably more expensive. Quisling himself is a source of continuing German embarrassment. The leader of the National Samling, the Norwegian National Unity Party, and the only Norwegian political movement willing to cooperate with German occupation, he is a man who has spent his career making enemies and accumulating a reputation for incompetence that even his German sponsors find difficult to work around. Hitler appoints him Minister-President of Norway in February 1942, and he spends the next 3 years trying to build a Norwegian collaborationist state, while the Norwegian population treats him with contempt so open that German officials occasionally note it in their administrative reports as a security concern. The name Quisling enters the English language as a synonym for traitor within weeks of the invasion. It remains there permanently. His government produces administrative complications rather than administrative efficiency, and the German authorities responsible for the occupation find themselves managing not the smooth administration of a compliant occupied territory, but the continuous suppression of a population that refuses to be compliant. The man with real authority over Norway is Reichskommissar Josef Terboven, a Nazi party functionary appointed by Hitler in April 1940 with powers equivalent to an absolute governor. Terboven is not a military man, but a political operative who believes that sufficient brutality will eventually produce submission. When Norwegian teachers refused to join a Nazi-organized professional association in the winter of 1941 and 1942, Terboven sends hundreds of them to the Arctic in forced labor. When the Norwegian church refuses to cooperate with occupation authorities, Terboven responds with arrests. When the resistance conducts operations, Terboven responds with reprisals. The execution of hostages, the destruction of villages, the transportation of Jews, 800 of whom are deported to Auschwitz in November 1942, of whom almost none survive. None of these measures break resistance, they intensify it. And intensified resistance requires more garrison troops, more Gestapo personnel, more counter-resistance infrastructure. The cost of occupation rises with each escalation of suppression. The garrison arithmetic is what makes the Norwegian commitment so consequential for the Wehrmacht as a whole. In the autumn of 1940, the garrison in Norway is approximately 100,000 men, significant but within the range of what might be considered proportionate to the territory held and the security requirement. By the spring of 1941, it has grown. Hitler, developing the conviction that Norway is the zone of fate where the war in the Atlantic and the Arctic will be decided, begins demanding more forces, more coastal guns, more fortifications. He reads captured British planning documents that discuss Norwegian operations. He receives intelligence reports about Allied exercises. He listens to Raeder, who shares his assessment of Norway's strategic importance, and to Dönitz, who wants more U-boat bases and better coastal coverage. The garrison grows to 200,000, then 300,000, then, by 1943, at the point when the Wehrmacht is simultaneously trying to hold a line at Kursk, a line in Italy, a line in the Kuban, and a line in the Atlantic, to nearly 400,000 men, 400,000 soldiers, fed, equipped, garrisoned, maintained, occupying a country of 3 million people with no active front. The specific arithmetic matters more than the abstract strategic assessment. A German infantry division in 1943 requires approximately 15,000 men to maintain at fighting strength. The Norwegian garrison absorbs the equivalent of more than 25 divisions. 25 divisions not available for the Eastern Front, not available to reinforce North Africa before Tunisia, not available for the reserve that German operational commanders request repeatedly and are repeatedly denied. General Friedrich Paulus, commanding the 6th Army surrounded at Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 and 1943, requests reinforcements that do not exist. Divisions in France and Norway are listed in the Wehrmacht order of battle. They are not released. Hitler will not release them. The catastrophe at Stalingrad, the largest German defeat to that point in the war, occurs partly because of decisions that have nothing to do with the Eastern Front, because of commitments in theaters where the threat being guarded against has not materialized and may never materialize. The British threat to Norway is real. It is never realized on the scale that Hitler fears, but it is real. Combined Operations Headquarters in London produces operational plans for Norwegian landings throughout 1941 and 1942. Churchill pressures his chiefs of staff for a Norwegian operation repeatedly. The chiefs of staff resist, and they are correct to resist. A major Allied landing on the Norwegian coast, against a prepared garrison of 300,000 men with Luftwaffe air cover across the difficult waters of the North Sea would have been extraordinarily costly and the outcome uncertain. The threat exists. Operations are planned, training is conducted, deception schemes are run to make the Germans believe a Norway landing is imminent, and it works in the sense that the threat successfully keeps German divisions in Norway. What does not work is converting that threat into an actual military advantage, because the threat only converts into an advantage if Germany commits disproportionate resources to countering it. Germany does commit disproportionate resources. The Allied threat is a strategic success that is never actualized as an operation. The garrison sits. The German formations in Norway, the 19th and 20th Mountain Corps, coastal artillery batteries, Luftwaffe fighter and maritime patrol units, naval detachments, train, maintain their positions, conduct small anti-resistance operations, and wait. 400,000 men wait for an attack that does not come. The Tirpitz encapsulates this paradox in a single hull. She arrives in Norwegian waters in January 1942 and remains there, moving between fjords for nearly 3 years. Her strategic purpose is to threaten Allied convoys to the Soviet Union, the Arctic convoys running from Iceland and Scotland to Murmansk and Archangel. In this role, she succeeds in a way that no other warship of the war quite manages. She ties down British naval resources vastly disproportionate to what she actually does. The threat of a sortie by the Tirpitz causes the British Admiralty to scatter Convoy PQ-17 in July 1942, one of the most costly Allied naval decisions of the war, resulting in the loss of 24 merchant vessels to aircraft and submarine attack. She sinks those ships without firing a gun. The mere news that she has left her anchorage produces a dispersal order that kills the convoy. This is strategic power of an unusual kind, a weapon that functions not by being used, but by existing. She makes one offensive sortie in her entire Norwegian career, a shore bombardment of a weather station on the remote Svalbard archipelago in September 1943. She fires her main armament for the first and only time against a target that presents no military resistance. She returns to her fjord. She is attacked repeatedly by British midget submarines in September 1943, which succeed in damaging her and putting her out of action for months, and by Lancaster bombers from No. 617 and No. 9 squadrons, RAF, which finally sink her with tallboy bombs in Tromsøfjord on November 12, 1944. She capsizes and burns. Between 1,000 and 1,200 of her crew are killed, trapped inside the upturned hull. She has fired her main armament in anger exactly once against a weather station in 3 years. The Norwegian resistance operations add a dimension to the occupation cost that the garrison figures do not capture. The Gunnerside mission of February 1943, in which a team of 9 Norwegian commandos, trained by the British Special Operations Executive and inserted by parachute into the Hardangervidda Plateau in midwinter, destroys the electrolysis cells at the Wehrmacht heavy water production facility. Heavy water is required for the German nuclear program. How far advanced that program is remains a subject of debate, but the Wehrmacht plant is the only facility in the world capable of producing heavy water in the quantities the program needs, and its destruction sets the program back by an amount that historians estimate at somewhere between 1 and 2 years. The commandos lose no men in the operation. The Germans respond with a security operation of several thousand troops searching the Hardangervidda for months without finding them. The 9 men ski out and cross into Sweden. The cost-exchange ratio of the Gunnerside mission, 9 men against several thousand German troops, an indefinite delay to a nuclear program, a destroyed facility that takes months to rebuild, is perhaps the most asymmetric of any single operation in the European war. It is made possible by the geography of Norway and the competence of men who grew up in it. It is representative, in extreme form, of the general pattern of the Norwegian resistance. Small operations with outsized strategic consequences, requiring large German counter-resistance efforts that are disproportionate to the direct military threat. The railway sabotage campaign run by the resistance through 1943 and 1944 achieves similar disproportionality. The single railway line running through central Norway carries us south and troops north. Disruption of that line requires repair parties, security detachments, engineering resources. Each act of sabotage is small. The cumulative effect of hundreds of acts of sabotage over 2 years is a persistent drag on German logistics in Norway that requires resources, trains, guards, repair materials that the German transportation system is struggling to find by 1944. The German Railway Administration in Norway complains in its quarterly reports about the impossibility of maintaining reliable schedules against an enemy that cannot be found and cannot be fixed in place. The problem is structural and unresolvable. The Norwegian resistance operations that punctuate the occupation years are, individually, small in scale. The Gunnerside mission of February 1943 is conducted by 9 men. The Vemork heavy water plant is a modest industrial facility by the standards of the targets Germany spends billions defending elsewhere. The railway sabotage campaigns through 1943 and 1944 are conducted by small teams with limited explosives working across enormous geographic distances. None of these operations, taken individually, constitutes a major military engagement or alters the tactical balance of the occupation. Cumulatively, across 5 years, they demonstrate something the German garrison command cannot resolve: that the occupation cannot be made secure at any garrison level Germany can afford to maintain, because the resistors are drawn from the population and the population is the terrain. German battalions can hold the ports and the major roads. They cannot occupy the people. They cannot pacify a nation that has decided not to be pacified and that has the geography, the thousands of kilometers of coastline, the hundreds of accessible fjords, the mountain plateaus that are impassable to vehicles but navigable by skiers, to sustain a covert infrastructure indefinitely. The Gunnerside mission deserves particular attention, both for what it achieves and for what it reveals about the nature of Norwegian resistance. The Norsk hydro plant at Vemork, built into a cliff face above the Mona River Gorge in the Telemark region, is the world's only facility capable of producing heavy water in quantities sufficient for a nuclear program. In 1942 and early 1943, it is producing approximately 120 kilograms of heavy water per month. The German nuclear program, which is pursuing a reactor design that requires heavy water as a moderator, needs this output. The British have tried to destroy the facility twice, once by glider assault in November 1942, which ends in disaster when both gliders crash in a storm and the survivors are executed by the Gestapo, and once by bombing, which is deemed too imprecise for a target built into cliff terrain. The Norwegian solution is direct. 9 men, trained by SOI in Scotland and inserted into Norway by parachute, cross the Hardangervidda Plateau on skis in winter conditions, descend the gorge, enter the facility through an unlocked cable shaft, place charges on the heavy water production cells, and exit the facility without firing a shot. The demolition charge destroys 6 months of heavy water production and damages equipment that takes months to repair. By some accounts, it sets the German nuclear program back by between 1 and 2 years. The 9 men ski out to Sweden. German security units numbering in the thousands search the Hardangervidda for months and find nothing. The mission is the most asymmetric operation of the European war by almost any measure. 9 men against an industrial target, against a nuclear program, against a security response involving thousands of garrison troops. It is possible because Norway's terrain makes it possible, and because the Norwegian men conducting it are, in the original sense of the word, native to that terrain. The resistance intelligence network operating alongside these direct action missions is, by 1943, feeding detailed information about German ship movements through Norwegian coastal waters to the British Admiralty on a near-daily basis. German warships, troop transports, naval vessels, their schedules, their routes, their cargoes are reported by observers along the Norwegian coast, whose communications reach London through a network of radio operators, small boats and couriers operating under conditions that carry a death sentence if discovered. This network contributes directly to the sinking of German vessels in Norwegian waters. It contributes to the planning of Royal Air Force raids against specific targets. It is a persistent intelligence advantage that the Germans cannot eliminate, because eliminating it would require either finding every radio operator along a coastline of several thousand kilometers or making the entire Norwegian population cooperative, and neither objective is achievable. The Gestapo and SD security apparatus that Terboven deploys in response to resistance activity absorbs its own share of resources. The Sicherheitspolizei in Norway by 1943 numbers in the thousands. Its operations, arrests, interrogations, executions, deportations, are conducted with the thoroughness that characterizes the security services everywhere in German-occupied Europe, and with the same result. They kill and capture individual resistance members and cells. They disrupt specific operations. They never break the network as a whole. The network reconstitutes. New members are recruited. The disrupted cells are replaced. The security apparatus expands in response. The expansion of the security apparatus requires more German personnel. More German personnel must be fed and housed and administered and equipped. The fixed cost of occupation rises with each cycle of suppression and reconstitution, and it rises faster than the suppression achieves its objectives, because the suppression itself generates the conditions that motivate more people to join the resistance. There is a final dimension to the Norwegian garrison that matters for understanding the larger trajectory of the war, and it concerns not what Germany put into Norway, but what it drew out of it. The Norwegian merchant fleet, one of the largest in the world in 1939, escapes German capture almost in its entirety in April 1940. Approximately 1,000 Norwegian ships, totaling roughly 4 million gross tons, are at sea on the day of the invasion. The Norwegian government in exile in London directs them to Allied ports. They spent the war carrying Allied supplies, Allied troops, Allied oil. The Norwegian sailors, 25,000 of them roughly, serve in these ships and die in them as Allied torpedoes and bombs and mines and German aircraft seek them out without distinguishing between nationality and cargo. Approximately 3,000 Norwegian merchant sailors are killed during the war. The ships they sail contribute ton-mile by ton-mile to the Allied logistics chain that keeps Britain supplied and eventually puts the invasion force on the beaches of Normandy. This is not the story of the German garrison in Norway. It is the other half of it. Germany seized the territory and failed to seize the fleet. The fleet was the real Norwegian contribution to the Allied war effort, and it escaped because the Norwegian government escaped. And the government escaped because Birger Eriksen opened fire at 0421 on April 9, 1940, and bought 4 minutes that the German plan could not account for. The Wehrmacht's inability to reduce the Norwegian commitment through the middle years of the war is inseparable from the broader dysfunction of the German strategic command system. Hitler's role as supreme commander is, by 1942, exercised in a way that makes rational reallocation of forces between theaters nearly impossible. Theater commanders request releases of troops and receive refusals. The refusals are not arbitrary. Each is accompanied by a strategic rationale that references specific intelligence about Allied intentions, specific assessments of what Norway's fall would mean for the U-boat campaign, specific concerns about Swedish iron ore if Norway's fall encouraged Sweden to reconsider its neutrality. The rationale is internally consistent. It is also, in aggregate, a system that cannot produce the flexibility that a losing war requires. A military system that can add commitments but cannot shed them is not a strategic system. It is an accumulation machine. Germany's accumulation machine, by 1943, is running at capacity across 7 distinct theatres simultaneously: the Eastern Front, North Africa, Italy, France, Norway, the Atlantic and the Balkans, with forces that were adequate for 1 or 2 major theatre commitments, but not for 7. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff and one of the officers who understands the aggregate situation most clearly, notes in his diary through 1943 and 1944 a pattern he describes in careful language that avoids direct criticism of Hitler: the disconnect between the forces available for active operations and the forces committed to passive defense of occupied territory. He does not say that Norway is a mistake. He does not say that the garrison should be reduced. He notes the arithmetic. The arithmetic speaks clearly enough for anyone willing to read it. It is not clear that Hitler, by 1943, is reading arithmetic clearly. He is reading maps. He is looking at the lines on maps that show the territory Germany holds. He does not want the lines to move. The lines in Norway have not moved since June 1940. They will not move until Germany surrenders. This is, in the logic of Hitler's late war psychology, a success. It is also, in the logic of military resources, a consumption. The Swedish dimension of the Norwegian question adds a layer of complexity that the purely military analysis misses. Sweden remains neutral throughout the war, and Swedish neutrality is itself a product of Norwegian occupation. Germany holds Norway. Norway borders Sweden. Sweden cannot challenge Germany militarily. Sweden therefore continues to permit the transit of German military personnel through Swedish territory. The transit agreement of 1940 and 1941 allows German troops and supplies to move by rail through Sweden between Norway and Germany, which is operationally significant. Sweden continues to sell iron ore to Germany through the Baltic route. Swedish iron ore from Kiruna, moving by sea through the Gulf of Bothnia when the ice allows, and by the alternative Luleå-Oxelösund rail route otherwise, supplements the Narvik ore and makes German steel production less vulnerable to any single point of disruption. The Norwegian occupation in this analysis contributes to Swedish compliance by demonstrating what happens to neutral Scandinavian countries that Germany considers strategically vital. The demonstration is intentional. It is one of the functions that the Norwegian garrison performs without anyone firing a shot. Whether it is worth 400,000 men is a question whose answer depends on what weight one assigns to Swedish iron ore, which is genuinely significant, perhaps more significant in aggregate than the Norwegian ore, and whether Sweden would have continued supplying Germany voluntarily without the demonstration effect of the occupied Norway next door. Historians disagree. The German military planners in 1940 believed the demonstration was necessary. The German military planners in 1944, paying for the demonstration with divisions they cannot spare for the Eastern Front, have a more complicated view. By 1944, the strategic situation is clear to almost everyone in the German command structure except Hitler himself. The Wehrmacht is losing the war on all fronts. The question is no longer whether the Reich will survive, but how quickly it will fall. In this context, the Norwegian garrison has become simply frozen. A vast military commitment that cannot be reduced because Hitler will not permit withdrawal from any occupied territory, and cannot be converted into offensive action because there is no offensive action that makes sense in Norway. It sits. It continues to sit. Through the summer and autumn of 1944, as German forces are collapsing in France, retreating across Ukraine, losing Finland to a separate peace, and conducting fighting withdrawals in Italy, the Norwegian garrison remains at strength and in position, consuming supply tonnage that the German logistics system has enormous difficulty providing. The supply chain from Germany to Norway, running by sea through the Skagerrak and Kattegat under increasing Allied air and naval pressure, becomes progressively more expensive to maintain. Ships are sunk, deliveries are disrupted. the garrison eats its stockpiles. By the spring of 1945, the Norwegian garrison is beginning to experience shortages of items that would have been considered routine supplies a year earlier. The German soldiers in Norway know by 1944 and 1945 that the war is being lost. They do not know, from their positions in Norwegian fjords and mountain valleys, exactly how lost it is. Communications from Germany are controlled. Morale reports from garrison commanders note, paradoxically, that morale in Norway is higher than on most other fronts, precisely because the men there are not being asked to stand and die. They are being asked to hold a quiet position. This is psychologically easier than the Eastern Front, where Soviet offensive operations in the summer of 1944 are destroying German army groups with a thoroughness that has no precedent in the war to that point. The men in Norway are not being consumed. They are being preserved at enormous cost for a battle that never arrives. General Franz Böhmer, who commands the Norwegian garrison in its final months after relieving Falkenhorst in late 1944, receives the news of Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, and spends the following days organizing the capitulation of his forces. He surrenders to the Allies approximately 350,000 men, organized in 11 divisions and 5 independent brigades, with their artillery, their vehicles, their coastal guns, their ammunition stocks. They lay down their arms in an orderly fashion. They are, on the day they surrender, a combat-effective military force. They have not been defeated in the field. They have been maintained at fighting strength through 5 years of occupation at a cost to the German war economy that historians have never fully quantified, but that all agree was substantial. An army that never fought, a fortress that was never attacked, a strategic commitment that never resolved. The historians who have examined the Norwegian campaign most rigorously, Geir Haar in his meticulous naval studies, Kersaudi in his account of the 1940 campaign, Hastings in his broader assessment of the war's peripheral campaigns, reach conclusions that are more nuanced than simple strategic condemnation suggests. The invasion of Norway was not irrational. The iron ore rationale was genuine. The U-boat basing advantage was real. The preemption of British mining operations was correctly timed, arriving before British mines could close the leads. On these narrow grounds, Weserübung achieved its objectives. The problem is not the decision to invade. The problem is the logic of what comes after invasion, the escalation of commitment, the refusal to adjust to changing strategic circumstances, the conversion of a temporary occupation force into a permanent garrison of 400,000 men guarding against a threat that has a real basis in British planning, but whose scale Hitler consistently overestimates, because overestimating threat is the default psychology of a man who cannot accept the idea of vulnerability. The Norwegian trap is not the trap of April 1940. The Norwegian trap is the trap of 1942 and 1943 and 1944, when the Wehrmacht is bleeding on the Eastern Front and in North Africa and in Italy, and 400,000 men in a country that is not going to be attacked are consuming resources that the Wehrmacht cannot afford to consume. The decision that looks brilliant in April 1940 looks like a fixed cost that cannot be shed from 1942 onwards. And fixed costs, when an organization is under existential pressure, kill organizations. The Wehrmacht is under existential pressure from late 1942 onwards. Norway is one of the places where it cannot shed costs it can no longer afford. It does not determine the outcome of the war. It is one part of the pattern. The fortress that drains, the garrison that endures, the commitment that compounds. Weserübung succeeds. It succeeds in April 1940, in the narrow tactical and operational sense of the word, and it never stops costing what that success required to sustain. If this story hit you, like and subscribe. We find these forgotten stories every single day. The Norwegian campaign raises a question that military historians still debate. Was the decision to maintain a 400,000-man garrison in Norway a rational response to a genuine Allied threat? Or was it Hitler's psychological inability to release occupied territory, the same instinct that kept him from permitting withdrawals at Stalingrad, applied to a theatre where it drained Germany without delivering any advantage? Was Norway a strategic necessity that became a strategic burden through rational escalation? Or was the garrison always going to become a trap the moment Germany decided it could not be reduced? Leave your answer below and watch this next video. You are not going to believe what these soldiers did.